The Taliban's acting foreign minister, Amir Khan Muttaqi, has slammed the United States and NATO. Muttaqi alleges US and NATO failed to bring peace and stability in the region despite a 20-year military presence and huge inflow of cash. Muttaqi's jibe at Western powers comes during a two-day visit to Pakistan, where he claimed the Taliban government is trying to carry forward a balanced policy in the peacemaking process. However, during his interaction with the media, Muttaqi failed to mention the growing number of ISIS-K attacks on the Taliban and even Afghan civilians.
پنځوس ملکونو امریکا و ناټو و لوی قدرتونه و د ډالرو بارانو بیا هم امن نسوای راوستای بیا هم نظام نسوای کنټرولولای بیا هم د قدرت جزیرې نسوای لمنځه وړلای نن چې موږ هغه کارونه ټول کړي دي او ټول دنیا ته اطمینان هم ورکړی زه نه پوهېږم چې اوس دوی نور څه مشکل لري چې له موږ نه یې غواړي.
The two-day meeting comes a day after New Delhi hosted the regional security dialogue on Afghanistan that was followed by a Troika Plus meeting hosted by Pakistan. The Taliban had welcomed India's high-level meeting and promised not to allow any terror attacks from Afghan soil. In a major U-turn, Pakistan pledged the facilitation of the transport of Indian wheat to Afghanistan via the Wagah border. Prime Minister Amir Khan said Pakistan may consider India's request for humanitarian purposes. India had asked to ease its wheat assistance to Afghanistan last month. Transport of nearly 50,000 metric tons of wheat had been stalled due to Pakistan's inaction. No country has recognized the Taliban government officially as yet, and the hardline Islamist outfit is keen to woo global powers, gain recognition and access to Afghan foreign reserves.
Latest news out of Afghanistan. Al Jazeera headliner: Taliban calls on U.S. Congress to release frozen U.S. assets, dated November 17, 2021. The Taliban has called on members of the United States Congress to act to release Afghan assets frozen after their August takeover of the country. In an open letter on Wednesday, Taliban Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi said the biggest challenge facing Afghanistan was financial insecurity, and the roots of this concern lead back to the freezing of assets of our people by the American government. Muttaqi later on went on to say, I request so that the doors for future relations are opened, assets of Afghanistan's central bank are unfrozen, and sanctions on our banks are lifted, and will consequently create further humanitarian and economic issues if not. Washington has seized nearly $9.5 billion in assets belonging to the Afghan central bank since the Taliban took power. In October, Deputy United States Treasury Secretary Wally Adeno told the U.S. Senate committee he saw no situation where the Taliban would be allowed to access the Afghan central bank reserves. Meanwhile, Afghanistan's aid-dependent economy has effectively collapsed, with civil servants unpaid for months and the Treasury unable to pay for imports. While concerned nations have pledged hundreds of millions in aid, many are reluctant to commit funds unless the Taliban agrees to a more inclusive government and to guarantee the rights of women and minorities. Muttaqi would note, I present to you our compliments and would like to share a few thoughts on our bilateral relations. Akin to other world countries, our bilateral relations have also experienced ups and downs. To date, Washington has not recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government in Afghanistan, although last week, the administration of President Biden announced that Qatar would serve as its diplomatic representative in the country. In the letter that Muttaqi argued that Afghanistan was enjoying a stable government for the first time in more than 40 years, a period that started with an invasion by the Soviet Union in 1979 and ended with the withdrawal of the last U.S. troops on August 31st of this year. The Taliban has previously ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, enacting brutal policies that violated human rights, particularly for women and girls. Their return to power has sparked fears about human rights. Since taking power, leaders of the group have sought to convince the international community that they intend to do things differently this time around. Although their decision not to appoint any female ministers so far and to mostly bar girls from returning to secondary school has done little to alleviate those concerns. Practical steps have been taken toward good governance, security, and transparency, Muttaqi wrote. No threat is posed to the regional world from Afghanistan, and a pathway has been paved for positive cooperation. Muttaqi also said that Afghans understood the concerns of the international community, but that it was necessary for all sides to take positive steps to build trust. He warned the U.S. risks further damaging the reputation in the country, and this will serve as the worst memory ingrained in Afghans at the hands of Americans. We hope that the members of the American Congress will think thoroughly in this regard, he added. CNN headliner, Taliban holds military parade with U.S.-made weapons in Kabul in show of strength. Dated November 16, 2021. Taliban forces held a military parade in Kabul on Sunday using captured American-made armored vehicles and Russian helicopters in a display that showed their ongoing transformation from an insurgent force to a regular standing army. Taliban operated as insurgent fighters for 2 decades, but have used a large stock of weapons and equipment left behind when the former Western-backed government collapsed in August to overhaul their forces. The parade was linked to the graduation of 250 freshly trained soldiers, Defense Ministry spokesman Ayatollah Khwarizmi said. The exercise involved dozens of U.S.-made M117 armored security vehicles driving slowly up and down a major Kabul road, with M17 helicopters patrolling overhead. Many soldiers carried American-made M4 assault rifles. Most of the weapons and equipment the Taliban forces are now using are those supplied by Washington to the American-backed government in Kabul in a bid to construct an Afghan national force capable of fighting the Taliban. Those forces melted away with the fleeing of Afghan President Ashraf Ghani from Afghanistan, leaving the Taliban to take over major military assets. Taliban officials have said that pilots, mechanics, and other specialists from the former Afghan National Army would be integrated into a new force, which has also started wearing conventional military uniforms in place of the traditional Afghan clothing normally worn by the fighters. According to a report late last year by the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, the U.S. government transferred to the Afghan government more than $28 billion worth of defense articles and services, including weapons, ammunition, vehicles, night vision devices, aircraft, and surveillance systems from 2002 to 2017. Some of the aircraft were flown into neighboring Central Asian countries by fleeing Afghan forces, but the Taliban have inherited other aircraft. It remains unclear how many are operational. As the U.S. troops departed, they destroyed more than 70 aircraft, dozens of armored vehicles, and disabled air defenses before flying out of Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport following a chaotic evacuation operation. Meanwhile, Taliban's foreign minister, Amir Khan Muttaqi, said that Afghanistan no longer needs a large military force. The remark made by the foreign minister is contradictory to the Taliban's chief, Qari Fashuddin, who recently said in a statement that the country needs another 5,000 troops for the force, most of them from the Afghan army. On Thursday, Muttaqi was in Pakistan with a 20-member delegation for negotiations on opening trade routes, among other things, where the special representatives from the United States, Russia, and China were present under the Troika Plus format. According to a report published by VOA News, Muttaqi bristled when he was asked about the issue of human rights and inclusivity in his administration, blaming the international community for misusing human rights. Muttaqi stated yesterday the opposition deserved to die, yet that was not a violation of human rights, and today it is in violation. Muttaqi also mentioned that the Taliban government is inclusive, as it has various ethnicities in it. He said the international community is forcing the Taliban to include their political opponents. He went on to say, we have never asked U.S. President Biden to include former President Trump in his cabinet. That's the latest news. Now, my thoughts. The Taliban wants to establish a legitimate government. However, there are many contradictions within their policies. First of all, their religious tenets and their Pashtunwali traditions. The Taliban, under the founder of Muhammad Mullah Omar, were a repressive regime, and they were made that way because the Soviets were, under their communist backers in Afghanistan, were rather brutal toward the Pashtuns and the native Afghans and slaughtered many wholesale, which caused the Islamic awakening of that year, which didn't just start in Afghanistan, it started in Iran, Saudi Arabia, and later Egypt, which gave way to the Arab Springs 30 years later. The revolutions that happen in these countries are basically at odds with the Western-backed dictators that lead them. Some of these leaders are basically former socialist regimes who had a working country. Afghanistan was a very Western country at one point, Western-themed country that enjoyed trade, that enjoyed independency from the West. And in 1952, we had the war on Arab nationalism coming from the British Foreign Office. And the United States joined in on that fight, and through the CIA, committed much of the turmoil that you see, which is still existing today. Now, not to say that all the blame belongs on them. We do have a very divided Afghan country, and that's basically because we had many clans within the country that were basically at odds with one another over the trivial of things. And we saw that during the Soviet invasion, when you had many Afghan tribal leaders that would basically switch sides. Some tribal leaders got more money than others. In fact, some of the intelligence apparatuses, like the CIA or the British MI6, the Pakistan ISI, would favor some tribal leaders over others. And one of them was the Hizb-e-Islami Party, the Ittihad-e-Islami, headed by Rasul Sayyaf, and the Hizb-e-Islami, headed by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And then you had the Northern Alliance by Ahmad Shah Massoud, who basically were fighting the Taliban. And the CIA provided no type of cooperation with the Northern Alliance, even though Ahmad Shah Massoud had warned the United States that Al-Qaeda was now in the country since 1996, and that the Taliban were giving them safe haven. Even though the Taliban were unaware with the secretive operations that were happening against the West, because they knew it would be suicide. And under the CIA Operation Jawbreaker, they basically eliminated most of the Taliban, but not all of them, as well as the Al-Qaeda. But why didn't they eliminate them all? Well, tell that to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, Tommy Franks, head of CENTCOM, and the Bush administration. They didn't allow the CIA-led forces on the ground to kill bin Laden when they had the chance. And Mullah Omar later died of natural causes while living close by to a U.S. military base. And bin Laden was assassinated in 2011. He lived on for an extra 10 years and lived under the auspices of the Pakistan ISI. The Afghans themselves are trying to have a country of their own, headed by the Quran and the Sunnah, or their interpretation thereof. Now, who's to say that we can't allow that to happen? If we're worried about women's rights, well, all we need to do is look within. The United States has a huge glaring problem of domestic violence against women. I consider this hypocrisy, moral hypocrisy on the U.S.'s part, that we're worried about the women of Afghanistan. Yes. Do I think the Taliban is a repressive entity? Yes. No more repressive than, say, the U.S. Federal government, which has a consistent habit of bombing and destabilizing Arab regime countries. This is just hypocrisy on the U.S.'s part. I don't want to hear about we're worried about women's rights coming from the legacy media. We're promoting this. Meanwhile, at the same time, they hire these retired four-star generals on CNN, on Fox, because there is no left and right paradigm when it comes to the Pentagon, talking about how we should go to war with countries that we should be allied with, specifically Iran, Syria, Lebanon. But yet, that's the lobbies talking to you from the Gulf and Israel, as well as the evangelical neocons who switch allegiances between the Republican and Democrats. Those are the people promoting war, and those are the repressive regimes. And I think it's high time the American people get an understanding of who our real enemies are.